The Bermuda Triangle has captured imaginations with stories of vanished planes and ships, but now a new scientific theory claims to finally have the answer. And the truth is stranger than any myth, but the reason is pretty simple. Take a look.
For more than half a century, the Bermuda Triangle has been seen as one of Earth's greatest unsolved mysteries, a place where ships supposedly vanish without a trace, aircraft disappear into clear skies, and unknown forces lurk beneath the Atlantic. Entire generations grew up hearing stories of Atlantis, alien abductions, magnetic anomalies, and even portals to other dimensions. But then they finally sent a drone to the bottom of the Bermuda Triangle, and it exposed the sheer scale of a world humans barely understand. But to make any sense of it all, we must time travel over a century back in the past, to the morning of March the 4th, 1918, swallowed by the ocean. It was on this fateful morning that one of the largest ships in the United States Navy slipped away from the docks of Salvador, Brazil, and pointed her bow north toward Baltimore. She was called USS Cyclops, a 542-foot-long collier capable of carrying thousands of tons of coal. On board were 309 men, passengers, and crew. The weather held steady, calm, and unbroken across the Atlantic. The route ahead was already etched into charts and memory. The destination waited beyond the horizon. In Baltimore, routines were already forming around her arrival date. Supplies were prepared, docking space allocated, and messages quietly marked with anticipation. And then, nothing. Days passed. Then more. The expected arrival date came and went without ceremony. No whistle on the harbor wind, no dark shape breaking the shipping lanes, no coded message crackling through early wireless systems. What should have been a predictable return turned into confusion that slowly hardened into concern. Reports were checked, logs reread, and shipping lanes monitored. Still nothing. Somewhere in the vast Atlantic corridor, the Cyclops had just vanished. No distress signal was ever sent. No fragments of wreckage were confidently identified. No survivors ever emerged to account for what happened between departure and disappearance. More than a century later, the loss of USS Cyclops remains one of the greatest non-combat disappearances in United States naval history. For many people, this was the moment the Bermuda Triangle mystery truly began. But the real story started much earlier, in an era when the Western Atlantic was becoming one of the busiest maritime corridors on Earth. During the 19th century, the waters stretching between Florida, Bermuda, Puerto Rico, and the Caribbean became increasingly crowded. Steamships joined sailing vessels as trade exploded between North America, Europe, South America, and the Caribbean islands. Cotton, sugar, coal, rum, machinery, and immigrants moved through these routes in ever-growing numbers. Ports such as Havana, Nassau, Bermuda, Charleston, New York, and San Juan became linked by a maritime network carrying millions of tons of cargo annually. Every increase in traffic brought opportunity, but it also brought risk. More ships crossing the ocean meant more ships encountering storms, reefs, navigational errors, and mechanical failures. The Atlantic itself was an unforgiving environment. Long before satellites and weather forecasting, captains often sailed directly into hurricanes without any warning. A storm could form hundreds of kilometers away and move toward a vessel faster than information could travel. In September 1870, the Atlantic entered one of its most violent seasonal shifts, but an average captain could only read the sky, the wind, and whatever fragments of experience he carried from past voyages. However, it was not enough. That month, a chain of storms swept across the Western Atlantic, carving through established shipping routes between the Caribbean, the eastern United States, and Bermuda. Merchant vessels left ports like Havana, Nassau, Charleston, and New York, carrying sugar, cotton, coal, and passengers. Some of them never reached their destinations. Others were last seen fighting heavy seas far from shore. In ports along the Atlantic seaboard, the absence became apparent only gradually. Ships that were expected within days failed to arrive. At first, delay was assumed. The sea was unpredictable, and late arrivals were common. But as more and more expected vessels failed to appear, concern began to replace patience. Harbor authorities checked registries, Shipping companies sent inquiries. Insurance records were quietly reviewed. Newspapers of the period reported the losses in restrained language, using phrases like "missing at sea" or "believed lost in storm." Without wreckage, without survivors washing ashore, and without any recovered instruments or cargo, there was no way to reconstruct the final moments. Then, a decade later, in 1881, the merchant vessel Ellen Austin encountered a derelict ship drifting in the Atlantic. According to later retellings, a prize crew boarded the abandoned vessel, only for the ship to disappear again under mysterious circumstances. The tale is not considered purely factual by most historians, but it does illustrate an important pattern. The 19th century Atlantic was filled with stories that blurred the line between fact, rumor, and maritime folklore. Poor documentation often allowed mysteries to grow larger with each retelling. Navigation itself remained an imperfect science. Mariners relied on celestial observations, compasses, chronometers, and dead reckoning. A small calculation error could place a ship dozens of miles from its assumed position. Charts contained inaccuracies. Reefs shifted. Strong currents altered courses. Among the most powerful of these currents was the Gulf Stream, a massive river of warm water flowing northward through the western Atlantic at speeds that can exceed 4 knots. A damaged vessel entering the current could be carried far from its last known location, complicating any search effort. Moreover, before widespread radio adoption in the early 20th century, ships often vanished silently. If a vessel encountered trouble hundreds of miles offshore, there was no practical way to call for help. Families waited in uncertainty. Shipping companies waited for overdue arrivals. Eventually, insurance claims were filed, and the vessel was listed as lost. In many cases, nobody ever learned precisely where or why the disaster occurred. By the early 1900s, technology had improved, but not enough to eliminate uncertainty. Wireless radio was spreading, yet coverage remained inconsistent. Weather forecasting was still primitive by modern standards. Aircraft had begun appearing over the Atlantic. Pilots faced unreliable instruments, limited range, and rapidly changing weather conditions. Crashes often left little evidence. Decades after the disappearance of USS Cyclops in 1941, another Navy cargo ship, USS Proteus, disappeared while carrying bauxite. A few months afterward, her sister ship, USS Nereus, vanished on a similar route. Both vessels belonged to the same class as Cyclops. Suddenly, writers noticed a pattern. 3 related ships, 3 disappearances. No survivors, no definitive explanation. Small civilian planes also occasionally disappeared over the Caribbean and Western Atlantic. For most of maritime history, ship losses had been viewed as individual tragedies. A hurricane sank one vessel, a reef wrecked another. A navigational error doomed a third. But during the mid-20th century, authors and journalists began collecting these incidents into a single geographical narrative. Instead of isolated events, they became chapters in a larger story. The emergence of the Bermuda Triangle idea. If someone had asked a sailor in 1940 about a mysterious triangle stretching between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, he likely would have looked puzzled. The incidents that would later become famous were already on record, but nobody considered them part of a single phenomenon. But it all changed in the post-war era. By the 1950s, aviation had shrunk the world, mass-market magazines were booming, and publishers were hungry for mysteries. Unsolved disappearances suddenly became marketable stories. One event in particular kept resurfacing, the loss of 5 U.S. Navy bombers known as Flight 19. On December 5, 1945, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers departed Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale for a routine training mission. 14 airmen were aboard. The flight leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, soon reported navigational confusion. Radio transmissions suggested the crews could not determine their position. As fuel dwindled, communication became increasingly chaotic. None of the aircraft returned. The search that followed only intensified the mystery. A Martin PBM Mariner flying boat carrying 13 crew members launched to search for Flight 19. Roughly 20 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft also disappeared. In a single evening, 27 men were gone. The U.S. Navy conducted an enormous search covering more than 250,000 square miles of ocean. Nothing was found. In September 1950, Edward Van Winkle Jones, an Associated Press writer, published an article drawing attention to a curious concentration of disappearances in the western Atlantic. Jones did not fully develop the Bermuda Triangle concept, but he planted the seed. Instead of discussing incidents individually, he hinted that a particular region might be associated with unusual losses. 2 years later, the story evolved further. In 1952, writer George Sand published an article in Fate magazine titled "Sea Mystery at Our Back Door." The piece discussed disappearances involving ships and aircraft within a triangular area. Sand's article shifted the focus away from individual incidents and toward geography itself. The location became the protagonist. Then came the man most responsible for giving the mystery its famous name. In February 1964, writer Vincent Gaddis published an article in Argosy magazine titled "The Deadly Bermuda Triangle." For the first time, the phrase Bermuda Triangle entered popular culture in a major way. Gaddis connected incidents such as Flight 19, U.S. Cyclops, and other disappearances into a single narrative. The timing could not have been better. The 1960s were filled with fascination about unexplained phenomena. UFO sightings were making headlines. The space race was underway. Popular culture was increasingly comfortable entertaining extraordinary possibilities. The Bermuda Triangle fit perfectly into that environment. By the early 1970s, the Bermuda Triangle had become a publishing phenomenon. Authors competed to find new disappearances and new theories. Books sold millions of copies worldwide. Television documentaries introduced the mystery to audiences who had never seen the original reports. Cases that had once occupied a few paragraphs in newspaper archives were transformed into legendary mysteries. Then, in 1974, writer Charles Berlitz published his book, The Bermuda Triangle: Myths and Popular Culture. Amplification. Berlitz's book became an international bestseller, selling millions of copies and being translated into numerous languages. The author was already famous for language-learning books, giving him a credibility that many readers did not question. His work presented the Triangle not merely as a region with unexplained disappearances, but as a place where conventional explanations might no longer apply. Cases such as Flight 19, USS Cyclops, and other losses were woven together into a narrative suggesting that unknown forces were operating in the western Atlantic. The success of Berlitz's book created an entire industry. Publishers quickly realized that mysteries sold better than mundane explanations. A vessel sinking in a hurricane was unfortunate. A vessel vanishing into an unknown force was fascinating. New books appeared almost yearly throughout the late 1970s and 1980s. Authors recycled older incidents, added newly reported disappearances, and introduced increasingly dramatic theories. One of the earliest theories to gain widespread popularity involved Atlantis. Theorists thought of the Bermuda Triangle as the possible location of the lost civilization of Atlantis, first mentioned by the Greek philosopher Plato. In these versions, Atlantis was imagined as an advanced society that supposedly sank beneath the Atlantic, leaving behind hidden structures or energy sources that interfered with ships and navigation. During the Cold War period, UFO theories also entered the narrative. Writers suggested that unidentified flying objects were responsible for missing ships and aircraft. Other explanations went further, suggesting the Bermuda Triangle contained portals to other dimensions or caused space-time distortions. Reports of electronic fog and compass failures were also shared. Magnetic anomaly claims said compasses behave strangely in the region. In reality, Earth's magnetic field naturally varies across the world, and navigators already account for this. The Bermuda Triangle is not unusual in this way. From the 1970s to the 1980s, television and documentaries made these ideas much more popular. But the theories collapsed rather quickly under scrutiny. In fact, this is exactly what happened when drones were sent to the bottom of the ocean. They finally sent a drone to the Bermuda Triangle bottom. Let's get one thing straight. The Bermuda Triangle is not an officially recognized geographic region. The commonly cited corners are Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, enclosing roughly 500,000 square miles or 1.3 million square kilometers of the western Atlantic. And that area is not some untouched void. It contains major shipping lanes, military routes, fishing grounds, coral ecosystems, and deep ocean trenches. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA U.S. Navy programs, and universities such as Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution have spent decades surveying the seafloor using multi-beam sonar, seismic imaging, autonomous underwater vehicles, and remotely operated vehicles. What did they find? Not a lost civilization, not glowing alien machinery. They found an ocean floor that looked exactly like what geologists expected from a tectonically active Atlantic basin. Abyssal plains, underwater mountains called seamounts, steep submarine canyons, sediment fans, and fracture zones carved over millions of years. But then came the real shock. Scientists uncovered the Puerto Rico Trench, a massive scar in the Earth's crust stretching for hundreds of kilometers and plunging to more than 8,000 meters below sea level, deeper than most of the Atlantic had ever been studied in detail. But it wasn't just the depth that surprised researchers. It was the structure. Instead of a flat, empty basin, the trench revealed a broken, jagged world. Steep underwater cliffs, sharp ridges, collapsed slopes, and deep depressions that looked almost like a fractured landscape. This entire system exists because of a slow but powerful collision between the Caribbean plate and the North American plate, where one slab of Earth is being forced beneath another over millions of years. Then in 2014 and 2015, NOAA's Okeanos Explorer conducted deep-sea missions around Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands using ROVs, capable of transmitting live high-definition video from the seabed. Scientists documented black coral forests, glass sponges, deep-sea shrimp, bioluminescent organisms, and many species new to science. Some corals in the region are estimated to be centuries old, growing slowly in cold, dark waters where sunlight never reaches. One particularly fascinating discovery involved deep-sea coral gardens clinging to the slopes of underwater mountains. These ecosystems function much like rainforests of the deep ocean, providing habitat for fish, crustaceans, and invertebrates. Researchers also observed comb jellies, colonial tunicates, brittle stars, and unusual sponge communities that had rarely been studied in detail before. Then there were the wrecks, Spanish galleons, colonial merchant ships, World War II vessels, and modern wrecks. Some have been found, many remain missing. But that is less mysterious than it sounds. Searching for a wreck in the deep ocean is like searching for a car in a mountain range the size of a continent. A ship sinking in 4,000 to 8,000 meters of water leaves very little visible evidence at the surface, and currents like the Gulf Stream can disperse debris rapidly over huge distances. Take USS Cyclops, the 1918 naval collier that vanished with 309 people aboard. It remains one of the most famous unsolved maritime disappearances. But modern historians point to plausible explanations. The ship was carrying a dense load of manganese ore, may have been structurally compromised, and was operating during wartime under difficult conditions. The lack of a confirmed wreck is frustrating, yes, but it is not extraordinary. The same pattern appears again and again when investigators revisit Bermuda Triangle cases. Flight 19, the 5 U.S. Navy bombers lost in 1945, likely succumbed to navigational confusion and fuel exhaustion. The rescue plane sent after them, a PBM Mariner, was an aircraft type known for fuel vapor explosions. Many other disappearances occurred during hurricanes, tropical storms, or periods of poor visibility. In heavily traveled waters, accidents accumulate over time, and that heavily traveled part is crucial. The Bermuda Triangle sits astride some of the busiest sea and air routes in the world. Ships moving between North America, Europe, the Caribbean, and South America pass through the region constantly. So do commercial aircraft flying between the eastern United States and the Caribbean, or Latin America. When millions of journeys occur over decades, a certain number of accidents is statistically inevitable. NOAA and other researchers have repeatedly concluded that the region does not show an unusually high rate of disappearances compared with other heavily trafficked ocean areas. That does not mean every case is solved. Only a fraction of Earth's seafloor has been mapped in high resolution. Even today, large areas of the Atlantic are known only in broad outline. New wreck, geological formations, and species are still being discovered. In 2019, for example, researchers studying the Bermuda region identified evidence of an unusual 20-kilometer-thick mantle transition layer beneath Bermuda itself, a legitimate geological puzzle related to the island's volcanic origin. The technology used in modern expeditions is astonishingly advanced. UVs can cruise autonomously for hours, scanning the seabed with sonar. ROVs descend on fiber optic tethers carrying cameras, robotic arms, and sampling tools. Multi-beam sonar paints detailed topographic maps of the ocean floor by sending sound waves downward and measuring their return. Seismic surveys image structures beneath the seabed itself, revealing layers of sediment and rock. The real mystery surrounding the Bermuda Triangle was how little humans knew about the deep ocean for so long. Until the late 20th century, much of the Atlantic seafloor was effectively invisible to us. We had better maps of the moon than of our own ocean depths. That ignorance created space for speculation. Into that gap rushed Atlantis theories, UFO stories, magnetic anomalies, and time warps. As the seafloor became mapped and studied, the supernatural explanations steadily lost ground. Scientists found tectonics instead of portals, coral ecosystems instead of alien cities, and shipwrecks consistent with ordinary maritime disasters rather than impossible vanishings. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.